Thank you. So I think we now moved our last presentation, and we're going from the Pyrenees to the Alpine area. So it's a presentation by Paolo Biella, Bumblebees foraging and cold adapted bumblebees of the Alps. Paolo.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hi to everyone. I'm Paolo. I work in Milan at the University of Milano-Bicocca, and I will speak about bumblebees foraging, how important is that, and I will focus on the Alps and especially on cold adapted bumblebees. First of all, before starting with the results and the topics, let me thank the organizers of this wonderful meeting. It has been so far extremely exciting to follow the results and the contribution from colleagues all around Europe. And I hope that everyone who is listening is also excited as I am now. So let's go to the presentation. Here I'm showing you simplified bumblebee equation. Basically, at the beginning of the season, you have the queen or just a few workers, and they need to collect resources from the plants, especially pollen. Pollen is the source of protein and of lipids, and this is important for the body mass of the larvae and of the future adults. So this, in order to get more, to have a colony that is productive, you really, the bumblebees really need to collect resources from the flowers. However, for us as scientists, it's a bit tricky to identify precisely the pollen, to which plants the pollen bumblebees collect, which plants they belong to. So a few years ago, we set up an experiment with a number of colleagues. We focused on one very common species of bumblebee, and we checked which plants the workers were collecting. And to do so, we took the pollen from the workers just before entering the nest. And in this way, we were able, by using some technology, some DNA-based recognition, we were able to reconstruct, like a little time travel machine, to reconstruct which plants the bumblebee visited. And then we studied the foraging of these workers. I forgot to mention, this is published online, it's open access, and you can check it out later if you're interested. It also involved an experiment on on colony size, the population of workers. But here I will speak about the plants. We found that 60% of the pollen pellets, they were polyfloral. It means that most of the workers do mix pollen from different plant sources. And furthermore, the experiment took place only in a short time frame, only 2 weeks, and only 140 workers were collected. But we found 34 plant species overall. This is for what I'm trying to say is that the plant diversity really, really matters for bumblebees, especially for pollen, which is important itself. And this was, as I mentioned, focused on one species of bumblebee, that is Bombus terrestris. It is very generalist as behavior, but I'm quite confident that it applies to many other pollinators as well. So flowers are important. They are important in our human-dominated landscapes, but they are important also in the mountains. And in the next part of the talk, I will focus on the importance of the Alpine region. We can start the second part by looking at some patterns of species richness. Here is a poster that Jeff Ollerton and I made a few years ago. We never published it because we were busy with other researches. But what we tried to look at was for trends in latitude in the Americas and in Europe, And by assembling a data set taken from surveys from small areas, and that happened recently in the last 10, 15 years, from areas that were small, for example, a mountain or a small, really small protected area. And what we found a number of interesting stuff, but what I want to address here is that bumblebee diversity in Europe peaked around the 45 degree of latitude. It's a shallow peak, so it's actually a wider range of latitude involved in this trend. But as a reference, we can take this value, and we asked ourselves what's in there at this latitude. The answer is pretty clear from this map. It's the mountains, in particularly the Alps, but also the other main European mountains like Carpathians, like Pyrenees, Cantabrian mountains. They all lie on this belt, around 45 degree of latitude. So here we see that mountains are really important for the diversity of bumblebees. Alps in particular are quite important. They as a surface, the alpine area covers only 10% of Europe. But if we look at which species occur in this region at any elevation, so including also the lower elevations, I could count up to 39 species of bumblebees occurring in the alpine area. This means that it's more than half of Europe bumblebees that live in the Alps in a broader sense. And this is very, very important for conservation and for raising awareness of the importance of the alpine region for conservation of this important group of insects and of pollinators. The next step I would like to make is to look at what we could call cold diversity, which is the proportion of bumblebees occurring in the Alps, which can be found above the tree line. For those who are not familiar with the concept of the tree line, simply, I'm sure you are familiar with the fact that if you go on an altitudinal transect, you will at some point notice the forest is not growing anymore and leaves space to open areas dominated by grasslands and meadows. That's the tree line. And what is occurring above the tree line is usually considered as cold adapted or using a colder environment. So to look at the diversity of bumblebees and actually species richness of bumblebees occurring above the tree line, I will use the data that were gathered in previous meetings. I'm referring to Alpine Bombus International meeting that gathered together a big number of experts. And we had one day of conference, but we also had one day of excursion in a protected area to collect data to give back to the administration of the protected area to help them with conservation of their bumblebees. And we can look at the data, the numbers we collected, and both in the 2016 and 2018, we found high diversity of bumblebees above the tree line, something between 17 and 19 species for those who like the numbers. But this means, in other words, this means that half of the bumblebees that live in the alpine region, they occur above the tree line. So it's important to think how are we managing these areas. We can focus now a little bit more on the cold adapted species, and I will report only the examples of 3 species I've been focusing on in the more recent years. I will show a video of the first species, Bombus mucidus. The video was provided by a colleague of mine, and this is Bombus mucidus, very colorful, nice looking bumblebee. It lives in the Alps, but also in the Pyrenees and also in the Balkanic area. It is quite rare to find. Population is believed that they are a bit fragmented. It lives here and there, and it's not really clear. In Switzerland, you can now focus on the left, on the plot on the left of the screen. In Switzerland, the altitudinal occurrence of these bumblebees is centered around the tree line, so about 1,600 meters to 2,000 meters. The other species I would like to present you is Bombus mendax. Again, we have a nice video of worker foraging in flowers. As you can see, has different coloration from the previous bumblebee. And it is also different because it lives higher uphill than Bombus mucidus. Bombus mendax in the Alps occurs around 2,000 meters and above. I specified here in the title that there is a subspecies that is exclusive of the Alps, that is Bombus mendax. The other subspecies lives in the Pyrenees. And the third species I would like to speak about is Bombus alpinus. It is a very important species, very rare. And as you can see from the plot in the top of the screen, the altitude is very, very high, above 2,400 meters, up to 3,000 meters. So it's really a bumblebee that occurs really high in the mountains. Again, there is a subspecies that is exclusive of the Alps, that is Bombus alpinus helleri. And we focused on this subspecies a few years ago with some colleagues. And I will present here some results. First of all, we looked at the flower visitation by these, the flowers that were visited by this bumblebee, and we listed all the occurrences that we knew from the Alps, about 100, 150 records. And we found that it was captured or recorded up to 40 plant species. So again, to remark that even the highest altitude having flowers is important for bumblebees. And these are pictures of the most frequently recorded plants. We also looked at the habitat requirement of this bumblebee, and we studied the probability of finding this bumblebee in relation to the habitat. We focused on glaciers, for example. Sorry, a minute. Sto registrando. Arrivederci. Sorry, I'm at the university and there is some service controlling who is occupying the areas. So there is, we studied the distance from the glaciers and we found the probability of occurrence of this Bombus alpinus helleri decreased as far as one goes from the glacier. So having glaciers is important for this bumblebee as a feature characterizing the habitat. We also looked at the climate of this area. Here we present only one of the several climatic aspects we focused on. And for example, we found that it's more probable to find these species where the climate is cold and stably cold during the year. So where summers are not so hot. In other words, it occurs at the highest altitude. We put together a data set focusing on these three species, Bombus mucidus, Bombus alpinus, and Bombus helleri, and Bombus alpinus and Bombus mendax. And we looked at changes in distribution in altitude over time. And we found some interesting patterns here. I will remind you that these three species occur at different, slightly different altitudes. Bombus mucidus on the left of the screen is the one that is slightly lower in altitude. It started since 1987. It started to go uphill. Similarly, Bombus alpinus from 1984 started to abandon the lowest altitude. You should remember that Bombus alpinus is the one that is highest in the mountains. So it abandoned the lowest altitude. And Bombus mendax, the one bumblebee between the other two, also started to go farther up in distribution. And the three of them started this pattern in the 80s. So we should ask ourselves what happened in the 80s to harm so much alpine bumblebees, and I will look into that. But changes in distribution are very relevant for the conservation of these species. Colonizing new land has a number of different risks and odds that a species should face. For example, if we focus on Bombus alpinus, the one that is the highest in the mountains, abandoning the lowest altitude means having progressively more fragmented population, because they will occupy the highest peaks, and they will serve as likewise islands. So the population will be fragmented. And this was just one example of the many implications that moving uphill could have on these bumblebees. So what happened in the 80s? Okay, Nicolas Cage started making movies. Obviously, there has been a lot of jokes about correlations between Mr. Cage production and biological events, but I think it's not the case for the bumblebees. Actually, it's the climate that changed, and temperature became progressively hotter and hotter and hotter from the 80s, especially. You see here two different areas of the world showing similar pattern. On the left, you see the deviation of temperature compared to the beginning of the century in the whole Europe, and you can see from the 80s the light green line starts to be really steep, and likewise in the Alps. These are maps from Switzerland. You can see that the temperature really increased and started doing that from the 80s. So both in Europe and in the Alps, this trend happened. So to sum up the information I provided in this presentation, I hope I made clear that plant diversity is really relevant for bumblebees, especially for the generalist ones, and it is relevant also for other pollinators as well. Alps are a core area for many European bumblebees, and we should keep that in mind when we design both European level and regional alpine level conservation measures. Cold adapted bumblebees have a narrow environmental requirement, as exemplified by Bombus alpinus, and in general, cold adapted bumblebees are sensitive to changes. As we saw, they went up in the mountains. So in other words, climate change leaves a mark on species, on ecosystems, and it's particularly striking for me to notice that it leaves a mark in areas of the world where people are not densely inhabiting. So above the tree line, not many people live there, and still there are bumblebees occurring above the tree line, which are facing the problems of climate change. And this is actually, for us humans, it should be quite a thing to think about. So this has have a number of conservation implications, which I will not present now, but there is room for more discussion and research in future. To conclude, I would like to thank everyone who helped with these data I showed. These results came from a number of collaboration with institutions and colleagues who shared the data, a lot of field work in previous years. So to all of them, my most sincere thanks. I would also like to thank those who shared the videos and the photos I used in this presentation, because they are important for addressing and for showing the results. And lastly, again, thanks to the organizers of this really interesting, really important symposium. And I will take questions, of course.
Okay, thank you. So there are several questions with partly the same topic, so I will combine them. People are asking if there are already examples of ranges becoming fragmented or of local extinction in the Alps.
We did some preliminary research on this, and we found that yes, especially on Bombus alpinus, we had some preliminary analysis showing that in future the area will progressively decrease and it will start to fragment and fragment and fragment. The question is really interesting because Bombus alpinus is the highest of the bumblebee community, but what about the other bumblebees? So I think should be extended to more species, definitely. And we are actually working on that. At least it's our plan for the future months on these 3 species and 1 species from the Apennine as well. But there is, as I said, a lot of species in the Alps, so there is really room for a lot of research. Anyone is welcome, indeed.
Thank you. Another question by Samuel de Rijke. Is the takeaway in relation to glaciers that not only a move in altitude will become a conservation risk, but also a lack of water for flowers to survive by the disappearing of the glaciers?
Yes, alpine meadows are under a number of different kinds of threats. For example, pastures, they are not always wisely managed. So the areas where a lot of cows are, there are less flowers, and there's a number of issues for bumblebees. But also definitely the melting of glaciers is really an issue. Alps provide, I think, 90% of the water for Europe. So it will definitely affect human societies first, and also the alpine community of plants and pollinators and animals living there. The issue of melting of the glacier is really, really an important topic in general, I think.
Okay, and one more question. So I was wondering if one of the changes since the 1980s is not also that the fact that it's now easier to go to higher areas in the Alps. So the access is becoming easier. So how do you
Yeah, it's a smart question actually, because I Googled yesterday. I was thinking about possible question. I Googled. The GPS was made commercially available in 1983. So it's kind of, there is also not only the people starting going hiking a bit more, and especially entomologists, but also there is an advance in technology which is allowing for more detailed data, especially geographically explicit data to be collected. However, if we look at the historical threshold of lower and higher altitudinal range, not only the mean, I showed the mean in the plots, but if we look at the threshold higher or the variation around the mean, we can see that it's pretty much consistent during time. So it's true that probably there were less data from higher altitudes back in time, but there were some. So when you check the extension of the altitudinal range, you see that is consistent. For example, Bombus alpinus, it was recorded at 3,000 meters even before the 80s. So.
Okay, thank you.